So if you're like the typical salesperson, you know for a fact that you aren't going to sell to every lead on your leads list. And it's not because you aren't good at your job. It's because not every leads list is full of good leads. There's always some leads that aren't going to be that productive. Now, how can you figure out which of those leads are worth your time and energy and which ones aren't? Well, the tool we use to figure that out is qualification, and it's probably the single most undervalued tool in the trade. The sales concept of qualification has been around for more than 30 years. It was IBM who really innovated the idea with an acronym BANT, B-A-N-T, where qualification was decided to be budget, authority, need, and time frame. And the general use of the tool was if an opportunity had a budget behind it, if you were dealing with a person in authority, if the need had been established, and if there was a time frame in which a deal could close, then you knew that you had a qualified opportunity. And so we owe a lot of thanks to IBM and that framework, but in the subsequent decades, a lot of innovation needed to happen around the concept of qualification. So we've come up with a fresh framework that deals with 3 problems that salespeople face that haven't been dealt with in the prior frameworks. First of all, the creation of budget. Secondly, the important concept of alternatives. And thirdly, the complexity of client motivations. And those are 3 important problems. Let's take a look at what that framework does to deal with those problems. Now, our framework is STAND, S-T-A-N-D. And those letters stand for spend, timeline, alternatives, need, and decision making. Let's take a look at how they work in practice. So the first letter in our criteria is S, and S stands for spend or spendability. And it's clearly not budget. It's important that we distinguish it from budget for a couple of reasons. First off, when we talk about spend, we're looking at the client's ability, willingness, and intention to spend money. And the reason why it's important to look at those things is in many, many B2B sales situations, a budget has not been set. And it's very difficult to ascertain whether there is budget unless we approach it from a different angle, which is to say, do you have the ability, the willingness, and the intention to spend money, as opposed to, is there a preset budget set out? So how can we figure out whether or not a prospect is actually willing, able, and has the intention to spend with us? Well, we can run a line of questions with them that aren't so simple as, do you have budget? For example, one question you can ask is, how does budgeting work for a project like this? Now that's open-ended, and it's a question with an open structure. And what that does is it invites your prospect to explore with you the mechanics of how decision makers may come together, budget may be sourced, opinions may be taken, and other things may be adjusted in order to create the requisite funds for a solution like yours. We can take a look at another kind of question, such as, is there a certain department or certain areas within the organization that budget will come from for an initiative like the one that we're talking about? Now, that's similarly open, but we're starting to specify, are there specific places or sources from which budget can be obtained? And again, we're not asking a simple question like, do you have budget? But we're asking, in what way do the mechanisms of the organization come together in order to produce the willingness, the capability, and the intention to spend on our solution? So let's take a look at T. T stands for timelines. And this is such an interesting piece of the criteria because if every other aspect of the deal is well aligned and coming together nicely, but timelines don't come together, everything else falls apart. We define timelines as all those different aspects of a deal that are time-based. And the reason why we define it that way is that we encourage you to put together a sequence, a mechanical sequence of all those different things that will affect the overall timeline of an opportunity. And in the same way as we did with S, Here we can ask a line of questions to our prospects in order to understand their timelines. What deadlines are you working against to complete this project? Now, I like this question because it invites your prospect to share with you those specific kinds of mechanics that go together to create a timeline inside a decision. Another question that you can ask is something like, are there any issues that would create delays for us in completing this deal together? Now, I really like that question because it positions you as peers with your prospect, where you're both sharing in the initiative to try to complete a deal on a reasonable timeline, and you're both working to prevent delays in case they come along. A stands for alternatives, and this is an area unique to the SAGE framework. Sometimes when we look at qualification frameworks, they're missing the one angle of competition. So what if you have budget, authority, need, and timeline, but you haven't considered that maybe somebody else up the road also does, and your prospect's just as happy to buy from them? What about competition? And in the SAGE framework, we want you to think about alternatives, which could be competition. So it could be that there's an alternative of using someone else who's a similar provider to you and a peer to you. But it also could mean the alternative of doing the work internally. So frequently, a deal actually falls apart because a client would like to provide the solution or the service themselves from their own internal teams. And there's a third alternative, which is doing nothing at all. And this is a very important one to understand as you do your qualification and discovery work with your prospects. So what are the kinds of questions that you can ask around alternatives? What would happen if you didn't engage external expertise for this? I like this question because it's a hypothetical, and it invites the client to think openly about, hey, maybe that's a possibility. Maybe I don't need to engage external expertise. And if the answer is actually negative for you and that they don't need you, just as well to find out early and disqualify the opportunity. Another question, getting more specific, may be, are there certain portions of this work that you think the internal team could handle themselves? Now, it may feel like you're playing against yourself in this case, but this is the whole mission of qualification, which is to see whether or not you're truly needed, whether or not there truly are alternatives to you doing the work. And so a question like this gives that your prospect full opportunity to say, actually, half of this project could be done internally by my own team. And now you can either adjust the opportunity, disqualify it altogether, or depending on the answer, qualify it on this basis. N stands for need. Need addresses the core motivations that actually drive a client to purchase. And even though we call it need, it's important to look underneath what that need is and see the various motivations that exist. For example, there could be pursuit of an opportunity. There could be removal or dismissal of a certain professional pain or a pain point. There could be the reduction of risk or a perceived point of risk, and so on. The motivations that clients have for buying are many. And so we capture them all under the umbrella of need, but it's important for you to understand how complex and how varied they can be. As a result, the kinds of questions that you need to ask to discover need tend to be pretty open-ended. And the first question I suggest is, can you give me an example? Now, this question is used in the middle of general dialogue and conversation as you're learning more about your prospect, about their business realities, about the milieu that they exist in. And we ask, can you give me an example, so that they and you can get clearer and clearer and clearer about what the underlying motivations actually are. So you cheerlead that prospect in sharing as much as they possibly can with you so that you become intimately familiar with the details of their business reality. Another kind of question that you can ask when you're exploring need: what would it be worth to you to capture this opportunity? Or how much is this problem costing you? Questions like this invite the prospect to quantify and measure the actual impact and scale of impact of the need or the challenge that they have. And this gives you two things: the actual scale that they use to quantify, as well as the way in which they think about their problem or their opportunity. Do they measure it in dollars? Do they measure it in time? Do they measure it in competition? And so forth. And so these are two examples out of many, but the kinds of questions you can ask to explore the concept and the criteria of need with your prospect. And finally, D, which stands for decision making. So we don't think about it as authority anymore because that implies that there's only a single person that will make a call. And more in B2B sales, the context is that multiple people come together to form a group decision around working with a vendor or a solution provider. There's certain kinds of questions that we can ask to explore decision making, and it's the job of the salesperson to map out all the different people who come together to make a decision and which role they play. So one question that's useful to ask is, besides you, is there anybody else that we should be including in this conversation? I like that question because it's open, it's participative, you're inviting that person to share with you, and depending on how they answer, you'll either see that they may be a bit protective of their role, or they may specifically articulate certain kinds of parties and the role that those parties need to play in coming to a final decision. A more precise version of this question, and a way to dig a little more closely, what role do you see legal playing in this situation? And here you can fill in the blank for legal with HR, tech, compliance, sales, and so forth. So it's a pointed question. What role do you think legal will have to play in making this decision? And there you are inviting specific information that will help you map out the mechanical ways in which a decision will be made by those various decision makers. So, in summary, STAND is a mnemonic tool. It's there to help you remember 5 criteria. STAND. Spend, timeline, alternatives, need, and decision making. And the ultimate value of having a qualification criteria like those 5 is that it will help you decide which leads and opportunities are no longer worth your time and energy and can be disqualified, and which ones deserve your focus and prioritization.